Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And in this particular lecture, we are looking at the topic of assessing ethical behavior. We've talked about ethics in general, and we've given you some definitions about ethical and unethical behavior in business and ways to look at the topic. And in this particular lecture, then, we are looking to give you a practical rubric for considering how to assess and judge behavior as either ethical or unethical. Let's climb right into it. The idea here is, as a manager, as a decision maker, when you witness particular behavior that you need to assess, is this ethical or is this unethical? There is a methodical process we suggest that you use, and you see the process here. The three-step process. Number one, gather the relevant factual information. Number two, after you've gathered all the relevant factual information, analyze the facts to determine the most appropriate moral values. Number three, make an ethical judgment based on how right or wrong the proposed activity or policy is. Now, let me see if I can give you an actual example. Several years ago, over at Cal State East Bay, I was teaching this very topic on ethics and asked the class if they had any examples of questionable or possibly unethical behavior in the workplace. And a student raised her hand and said, well, I don't directly at my job, but my cousin just experienced something horrible where she works. I asked her to specify what was she talking about. She said, well, my cousin works in this big office, in this big cube farm with a whole bunch of other people in little cubicles. And she has just never really gotten along with one of her coworkers. And to be honest, my cousin's a little overweight. Well, she and this other gal have always been at odds with each other. And just last week, something horrible happened, in which we asked, well, what was that? And she said, well, they got in this big, huge argument, this yelling match in the middle of the cube farm, and this person who really hates my cousin grabs a full glass of water, walks up to my cousin, throws the entire glass of water in her face, and says out loud, "Swim, Shamu, swim." Yeah, we can probably say that was horribly inappropriate, unethical behavior in the workplace, and there are going to be consequences for that kind of behavior. Now, picture this for a moment. Picture that you are the manager over this entire department, and this has just happened. And you are quietly working in your office on that week's report. You're working on a spreadsheet on your computer with the door closed, and what happens? 11:30 in the morning, the door flies open, and in walk these two gals, angry, yelling, one of them in tears. You have to do something about. Yes, you get the point, right? All of a sudden, you as a manager are in the middle, thrown into possibly an incident, a circumstance of horribly unethical behavior, and you need to figure out what your next step is. That's when we go back to this slide and encourage you. Number one, gather the relevant factual information. Number two, analyze the facts to determine the most appropriate moral values. Number three, make an ethical judgment based on how right or wrong the activity, in this case not proposed, but the actual activity actually ended up to be. How do you go about assessing this against the most appropriate moral values? Well, here too, we have some suggested categories for you. Number one, let's talk about ethical norms. You see 4 of them here. The first ethical norm is utility. Does the behavior, does the act, does the event, does it optimize the benefits to those who are affected by it? That is, do all relevant parties receive fair benefits? Number 2, rights. Does the activity or behavior respect the rights of all individuals involved? Number 3, justice. Is the behavior consistent with what's fair for all parties? And number 4, caring. Is it consistent with people's responsibilities to care for each other? Now, when we consider the story that I've just told you that my previous student told about her cousin, we can go right through this, right? Utility, does it maximize benefits? Rights, does it respect and adhere to rights for all parties involved? Just, is it fair and just to all parties involved? And does it demonstrate the appropriate level of care between employees, one for another? And of course, I think we immediately can have answers to each one of those. Now, in that particular instance, if you are the manager who needs to adjudicate this whole thing, you know what you need to do, right? You know that first of all, you need to separate the parties. You need to gather the relevant facts, that is the story, from each of these employees, as well as from salient witnesses who saw the whole thing. Now, the reason you go through this whole procedure is if you do this methodically, it accomplishes at least two very large things for you. By going through this methodical policy of separating them and then interviewing one at a time, it provides you time to let emotions cool down a little bit. And this can be very useful for you as a manager. Number two, of course, if you follow the same methodical policy whenever there has been an incident that needs your investigation, then you can document the fact that you are always following the exact same process and procedure. And that helps you maintain fairness and equity in the way that you administer managerial oversight to your employees. Now, let's give you an illustration from the textbook. This is then an illustrated model of ethical judgment making. And if you can't really see this too well on the slide, then you'll notice this is also reproduced from your textbooks. When you get through chapter 2 of the text, you'll see this diagram. You can study it in greater detail. And essentially what this attempts to show you is the process we've just told you about in these slides, right? Step 1, gather the relevant factual information. And you are then going to weigh this against the ethical norms that we discussed, the ethical norms of utility, rights, justice, and caring. You're going to try to analyze the facts to determine the most appropriate moral values. Is it no on all criteria, no on a few, or yes on all criteria? If it's no on one or two of the criteria, is there any reason for overriding one or two of these ethical norms? Is one ethical norm more important than the others in this particular circumstance? Is there any reason why a person may have been forced into committing an act or following a policy? And that's the way that you can make a judgment call, an assessment, a decision whether or not the act or policy is ethical or not ethical, and then act accordingly. In this particular case that we're talking about, of course, this got referred very quickly to the HR department after facts were gathered and appropriate policies and consequences were meted out, as you might guess. But not every event is that clear-cut, is it? Not every opportunity or policy or event is completely obvious until you gather all the relevant facts. And so, again, we would encourage you, this provides a useful, practical policy as a manager, as a leader, as a decision maker, when confronted with assessing behavior to make a judgment whether you believe that behavior or policy is ethical or unethical. Hope this is helpful for you. This is yet another tool to use in actual management and leadership as we continue our exploration of the topic of business ethics. We'll see you in the next lecture.